Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of FiST Chat, the vodcast that discusses topics related to film, science and technology. My name is Ben Warner and I'm joined by Steve Kern in Adelaide. How's it going there, Steve?
Everything here is just fantastic, Ben. Great to be here for another episode of FiST Chat.
Absolutely. And you're ready to talk about all things film and its potential future?
Of course we are. I think it'll be a very interesting discussion topic.
Absolutely. So just to, I guess, introduce what we're going to talk about today, there's been a lot of talk about the nature of film of late. We'll pick this up a bit later with George Lucas actually mentioning that 3D is the new kind of medium that film's going to morph into. But we'll get to that a bit later. But Steve, maybe would you be able to maybe just kick us off with maybe how going back maybe 50 years or so and how film was back then, and then we'll go forward and discuss where it's going to.
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. I mean, in the 50s, they produced literally thousands of films, and that was because there was a huge amount of content required for the cinemas, where films would change every 2 days. And I think in that regard, it's very interesting to see now that Hollywood actually produces far fewer films. In fact, I think in the last couple of years, Hollywood has produced about 1,100 to 1,200 films a year, and that's up from about 500 or 600 in about 2005, 2006. So the 50s were a time, probably, one of the high points in the Hollywood golden years. 3D film was launched, and it was part of a brave new era. But I don't know, where have we ended up, Ben?
Well, it's fascinating because you mentioned like 3D. There's been several. I mean, you think about like maybe today's generation would think 3D is all this new thing, but they've actually had a decent stab at this a few times, and it hasn't really taken off. Do you think that's just because they haven't quite got that quality of technology up, or is it just the way they told the story? What do you think was happening with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think actually 3D is, it's great, but what about 4D? The added dimension. For those of you who've been to Universal Studios, or probably, any of the other film studios like Warner Brothers, to the actual attractions, they have the 4D where you sit in the moving seats and get sprayed with air and water and whatever else. I think immersive technologies are probably the next step, as opposed to 3D, which really is starting to look pretty old-fashioned these days.
Well, I mentioned before George Lucas and James Cameron, and I think it was Jeffrey Katzenberg from DreamWorks were on a panel talking about 3D. And the interesting thing there was George Lucas made the bold pronouncement that, that 3D the move to 3D was akin to the move from black and white to color. And he was saying that when you watch a 2D film now, that's just like the experience of what people watched when they watched the black and white film back in, back in the day. It's funny because, for me personally, I like my 2D films just fine. I really have no interest in 3D at all. But that's another topic altogether. But what do you think about that?
Well, what I think about it, don't you find it a little bit strange that, if they started with 3D in the 1950s, 60 years on, we're still changing to it? I mean, that doesn't seem right to me. That doesn't seem like the next step. Surely in the 60 years, what about alternate realities? What about the animations like Final Fantasy and the fact that we'll have fantastic 3D graphics that you won't be able to tell actors apart from animations? What about the fact that, a lot of people are talking about alternate reality games that actually immerse you in your own movies, where you decide the outcomes and the scripts with your decisions? I would have thought that naturally would have been the next extension of cinema.
Well, that's interesting because the PC industry's gone a lot further, or the gaming industry's actually done a lot more in terms of that. I mean, there's been interactive games for at least since, I remember there was one called Wing Commander 3, I think. That was the first fully filmed had full video starring, Mr. Star Wars himself, Mark Hamill, and the whole thing was an interactive experience. And that was back in earlier than 95. I think that was 95, something like that. It was almost impossible to get the video to work off your Pentium 2 PC or whatever it was that you were using. But it's interesting how the different industries have worked that way. But it's just, if looking at that, I found that particular article with the quote from George Lucas, and it's interesting. You see the comment feed underneath that article, and there were a lot of comments there that were basically saying 3D gives me a headache. It doesn't interest me at all, and it almost seems like it has to be a certain type of film if it's going to be 3D. I think this idea that every film is 3D might be pushing it a bit too far.
Well, I think, Ben, you've already hit the nail on the head with the 2D is fine. I mean, 2D is a fine way to watch films. There's no problem with it. It may not give you a fully immersive experience, and in some films that might be required. And that's been the beauty of IMAX films, whether they're 3D or not, is that they are far more immersive than an ordinary 2D film. But I don't see what the problem is there. I mean, just look to books. You've got Kindles and e-readers today, but what do? They emulate, a book on a page. And I think 2D film, what might happen is the delivery might be different, the way we experience it might be different, whether we project it from mobile phones on the walls or whether it's on high-tech polymer sheets that, are only a few mil thick. But I think we'll still be watching 2D films because they don't take up much space, and they're like reading good old books, even if you read them electronically.
Yeah, the main issue for me with 3D films is that I don't personally think you need that extra dimension to give you any added benefit to what you're watching. I think it's like you're watching a 2D film and you can be immersed in the world with the story and everything, but there's still that separation there because it's not there with you. Whereas the 3D and all of that, Avatar was great and it made great use of the technology and the 3D aspect, and it was probably the only real film that's been made for 3D that's actually worked. But maybe it just needs to be more of a specific thing. But I mean, to me, sorry, yep.
Oh, I was just going to say, for 3D, I think 3D works if it's full animation. I don't think 3D really works for, for reality. That's 2D, but 3D works very well with animation.
Well, it's interesting because Christopher Nolan, when he's been getting a lot of pressure to shoot in 3D for Batman, the next Batman film, and it was even brought up as an issue for The Dark Knight. But he refused because, as far as he was concerned, I made the first film the old-fashioned way, and he's actually quite famous for not wanting to use any CG. Where he can, if he only uses it if he absolutely has to, and that makes a lot of sense. And it's good that he's got that kind of clout to say, no, I'm going to just, shoot it the way I want to shoot it and do it the way I think is going to be the best presentation for it. But maybe if just to pick up on a point you mentioned before about the old 4D aspect, that's actually something that's been tried quite often as well, hasn't it? I mean, aside from the old Universal Studios tour, didn't they actually used to do that in the, 20s and 30s as well?
Oh, look, they've tried it with everything from smell-o-vision and whatever other gimmicks as well. It's very expensive and it's unlikely to work. I mean, it's interesting, while they'll use e-readers again, while they've revolutionised the way we read books, they haven't really changed the way the words appear on the page. And I just think, for me, the only thing that can really change in terms of film would be a move to animation. And I'd be very keen to hear what you've got to say about this, Ben. As a director, would you prefer to direct animated actors that you created yourself, or would you prefer to work with real people?
No, I'd clearly prefer to work with real people, and
that's very well said, Ben. Very well said. No controversy here on FiST Chat.
For the simple reason is that I just don't have any patience for animation. I mean, having said that, maybe one day I might end up directing an animated film, but I don't think I'd want to be. I look at something like Avatar, what would have gone into making that, and I just don't think I would want to make something like that. I think I'd probably want to make something more, as I've mentioned before, like the Christopher Nolan type template, using as much real things as possible to shoot with. But you're right, I think animated films are the way to go for 3D because they seem to have caught on in the marketplace as something that works quite well in that regard in terms of 3D.
Yeah. Look, the other question I'd like to ask you then, Ben, is, as a filmmaker, and you seem quite orthodox in your love of 2D film and developments of scripts and that. How do you feel about the mix between gaming and film and the experience? Will gaming overtake film?
Well, gaming's already overtaken film in terms of in terms of market. I think in terms of dollars raised. I love the fact. I don't know if I'd make it myself, but I have no problem with this idea of film sequences in games. I mean, I actually really enjoyed a lot of the. I mean, I don't really play that many games anymore, but those couple of games that I had where we actually there were a lot of those film sequences, a lot of those first ones that actually came out. It was really really quite an immersive and interesting experience, and you got to, I guess, really go into the world and play the game while you're watching the story unfold. So it was a really fascinating thing. But it'll be interesting but the thing is, I've heard gamers don't really like that because they're saying, we're not here to watch a film, we're here to play a game. So which is an interesting
So would you say...
Sorry?
Sorry, Ben. Would you say that they will always remain separate and games will be games and films will be films, no matter how far in the future we look?
Well, I mean, it's impossible to say, but I mean, I think if we come to wrap this thing up, I think the concept behind the whole thing in the end is that just because you can do something doesn't mean you have to do it or it's going to work. If something has worked for 50 years or something like that, there probably is a reason why it works. And people enjoy it. The only thing you might need to innovate is, the new ideas and whatever, but technology doesn't necessarily make it any better. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I completely agree with you. I think, film exists because it is good. It's a good medium. I mean, you can talk about black and white to colour, you can talk about silent films to talkies, but those transitions happen very quickly. The fact that 3D hasn't happened in 50 years and still really is a specialty market, and while it has improved markedly, I don't think it always improves the story. It won't improve a good script, and I think that's Hollywood's real challenge. And for me, I think 2D films will exist for a long time.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. So thanks again, Steve, for the chat, and I look forward to another one. Next week, well, we haven't actually worked out a topic yet, but we do know it's going to be science-based. We've been talking a bit about film too much, I think, for the last couple of episodes. So we'll need to switch track, I think.
You can never talk film too much, Ben.
Absolutely. So until next week with our new science topic, which we'll announce soon, we'll catch you then.